All right, so second part of the week 8 lecture, we're going to be looking at an argument against physicalism. So most of the contemporary arguments against a very thoroughgoing and strict physicalism, which, as you'll recall, is the view that there's one and only one type of thing in the universe, and that's physical stuff. These arguments usually come from considerations of explaining, giving accounts of consciousness, right? So in philosophy of mind, consciousness is this really problematic phenomenon. Problematic in the sense that no one can seem to explain how it works. And not just in philosophy of mind, in neuroscience, consciousness is this thing that everyone wants to explain. It's like the Holy Grail, right? And it seems to provide these special difficulties because it's not clear where it comes from. It's obvious that we have it, but it's not clear why or sort of what causes it. So you occasionally find some articles in popular science type magazines which say, oh, we've discovered that consciousness is located right here in the cingulate gyrus. When you magnetically inhibit that area, people sort of lose their sense of themselves or something like that. None of these have been sort of robustly reproduced, and there's a lot of issues about the interpretation of the results, so on and so forth. We're not really going to talk about the science of it, but consciousness is a source of a great deal of difficulty and argumentation in philosophy. In particular, when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about what's called, in the jargon of philosophy of mind, phenomenal consciousness, right? So that is awareness of things that are happening, experience of things that are happening, right? So phenomenon just means sort of occurrences. So phenomenal consciousness is consciousness of occurrences. More generally, or more concretely, so we have this bullet point right here. Phenomenal consciousness refers to the felt experiences which accompany perceptions. So when you look at a stoplight and it's telling you to stop, the top light is lit. It is putting out visible frequency electromagnetic radiation on the order of 620 to 750 nanometers of wavelength. An object which reflects or emits light of that wavelength, when human beings see it, we experience it in this red way, right? So when something looks red to you, you're having a phenomenal conscious experience of it. When you taste, say, coffee, the bitterness of some black coffee, that bitterness is the phenomenal experience, right? Coffee is just a bunch of chemicals. The chemicals interact with the receptors in your taste buds and your nose, and it creates this experience which we call bitterness, right? So that's phenomenal consciousness, right? So this is the thing that's trying to be explained, and this is the thing which is thought to produce a great deal of trouble for physicalism. And the article that you'll read in the textbook for your reading sequence is also on the same topic of the difficulty of accounting for this in a physical theory. What we're going to look at in the lecture is David Chalmers' zombie argument, right? So a great deal of the reason why this argument is probably so well known, he put it forward in I think the late 90s or the early 2000s, and it's a version of an argument that's been around for quite some time, but he put it forward in a particularly very logically precise way, a very technical way, and also he called it zombies. So that I think it being called a zombie argument has a great deal, explains a great deal of why it caught on so well. Now, of course, the zombies we're talking about here are not sort of Walking Dead, Z Nation, Resident Evil, 28 days later type zombies, right? They're not flesh-eating, they don't have a disease, they aren't sort of particularly stupid or rotting, anything like that. Zombies here are exactly like you and I, you and me, exactly like You and exactly like you and me. But they don't have any sort of conscious experience, right? There's nothing it's like to be them. It's dark inside, so to speak. So when I see the top light of a stoplight, I have this experience as of seeing something red. When a zombie perceives the top light of a stoplight, it doesn't. There's nothing sort of it feels like. There's nothing it looks like to them. They'll respond in the same way. They'll say, "Light's red." They'll stop driving their car, so on and so forth. But they won't sort of experience anything. That's what we're supposed to imagine when we imagine a zombie. So zombies are physically identical to a regular human person. So we can imagine I have a zombie clone, a zombie twin. It's physically identical to me, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So there's two versions of the argument in the chapter. I went with the second one because it gives the more sweeping conclusion at the end. So let's go through this. I can conceive of a zombie world. That is, a world physically identical to ours, but in which there is no consciousness. Premise 2. If a zombie world is conceivable, then it is metaphysically possible. Conclusion 1. A zombie world is metaphysically possible. Just some simple modus ponens there. Premise 3. If a zombie world is metaphysically possible, then facts about consciousness are facts over and above physical facts. Conclusion 2. Facts about consciousness are over and above physical facts. Premise 4. If physicalism is true, then there are no facts about consciousness over and above physical facts. Conclusion 3, and this is the last part of it, physicalism is false. So this argument, as arguments in the textbook go, looks fairly straightforward, but it's actually incredibly complicated. We'll get into a little bit of the complication just to give you an idea of kind of why I referred to this as a sort of logically sophisticated and technical argument. We won't go too deep into it. Okay, so it starts right off the bat with the technicality. I can conceive of a zombie world, that is, a world physically identical to ours, but in which there is no consciousness. So conceive of has a very specific meaning here. And this, as the textbook chapter tells you, this is a version of what's called a conceivability argument, which proceeds from the fact that we can, in a sense, imagine something to the fact that that thing is possible. So you're saying, because if we can imagine it, it's possible in some sense. And so we've seen this type of argument already. We've seen it a little bit in the ontological argument for the existence of God, way at the beginning. That's in a way a conceivability argument, because it is a crucial step in that argument that because we have an idea of God, then that thing is possible. Because if something isn't possible, it can't exist. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion in the context of this argument about different types of conceivability and different types of possibility. We'll talk about the different types of possibility in a minute. But to conceive of something means to be able to form a clear and distinct idea of it. And so conceivability and the way Chalmers is using it is kind of referring to something like what Descartes says in his meditations, where he says that he has a clear and distinct idea of God, right? So Descartes' version of the ontological argument uses this notion very heavily. So clear and distinct means it's present to your mind. You have a good idea of it, all of its details, and you sort of know it's fully fleshed out and all that. So you could give a full description of it, right? And so in the ontological argument, and Anselm's version of it, the clear articulation of the idea of God is that than which there can be none greater, okay? It's always hard to remember the way that's formulated. So this means that we can give a clear idea of what a zombie world would be, and then that is provided for us in the second clause there. The zombie world is a world physically identical to ours in which there is no consciousness. Okay, well, that's a string of words. Does it actually mean anything? What does it mean? Well, physically identical. When philosophers, especially in philosophy of mind, use terms like physically identical or microphysically identical, microphysical duplication, physical duplication, they use these phrases a lot. What does it mean? Well, it means that there are two distinct objects, and those two distinct objects have all the same fundamental physical entities, and all of those fundamental physical entities are in the same states, arrangements, and relations. So in Star Trek, that's how transporters work. So they sort of make a copy of all the information about you at one place at one time, and then they make a copy of you at a new place and time on the basis of that information. Okay? So the person on the transporter pad that gets evaporated, they're gone, right? You get sort of torn apart. And then something which is physically identical to them shows up at the destination. It's reassembled from the matter that's already there. And so what you have is two things which are physically identical to each other. So suppose instead of the Star Trek transporter thing, suppose we sort of clone you, right? We clone you not by sort of extracting some of your DNA, but we clone you with some kind of sci-fi device and it just makes someone identical to you. The idea is that you'd have to be made out of the same stuff, right? Carbon and all that jazz. And that stuff would have to be in the same arrangements, right? So each of your molecules would have to be related to each other in the same way and in the same orientations, in the same states, etc., etc. That's what a physical duplicate is. That's what being physically identical entails. So when we say that there's a world physically identical to ours, that means if we were to write out every physical fact about it on a piece of paper, World 1 and World 2 would have the same list of facts, right? And they'd be in the same order and all that, right? So the idea is that we can imagine a world imagine two sheets of paper which have the exact same physical facts on them, but the second one doesn't have any consciousness facts on it, okay? So the idea is that the consciousness facts and the physical facts don't come with each other. That's sort of what Chalmers is driving at here. If a zombie world is conceivable, then it is metaphysically possible. So here's one of the places where this argument gets really technical. Why does he specify metaphysically possible? Well, because in philosophy we talk about several different types of possibility. There's at least three, probably more. So there's physical possibility, which is sometimes referred to as nomological possibility. Nomological just means in accordance with the laws of physics. So nomos in Greek is law. So when we say that something is physically possible, we mean that it's possible within the confines of the actual laws of nature. So it is not physically possible for a human being unaided to leap over a 30-story building in a single bound, right? That is not physically possible for a human being. Our muscles aren't capable of producing that type of power. Our bones aren't capable of withstanding that type of energy. So even if we did have the muscular power, as soon as you try to jump, you just snap all of your bones into tiny little pieces because they can't take that kind of force. Or when you landed on the other side, you'd explode, something like that. But that doesn't mean it's logically impossible. So it is logically possible for a human being to leap a tall building in a single bound. That is to say that there is no logical contradiction involved in envisioning that scenario, right? So it's possible, it's logically possible that pigs fly, even though it's physically impossible that pigs fly, right? Because pigs are too heavy. And, if you gave them wings, it just wouldn't work very well. Um, Now, so what types of things are logically impossible? Well, it's logically impossible to have a triangle with four sides, right? That's not logically possible. It's logically impossible to have a round square. It's logically impossible to be both entirely red and entirely green in the same way at the same time. It's logically impossible to both be fully clothed and fully unclothed at the same time, right? That's what a logical contradiction looks like. So that's the kind of thing which is logically impossible. Then there's also epistemic possibility, and this is possibility within the confines of what is believed, known, and or evidentially supported. So something is epistemically impossible if it's not consistent with what you already know. Now, of course, something could be physically possible even though it's epistemically impossible for you, right? Because you don't have the right knowledge to countenance its possibility. Something can be logically possible even though it's epistemically possible for you, given what you know and believe. So these types of possibilities are largely independent from each other. Usually we talk about physical possibility being smaller than logical possibility. Logical possibility contains physical possibility. Epistemic possibility kind of does this weird thing across the whole map there. So we say, I've not mentioned metaphysically possible yet, and there's a sort of contention as to what it means. It's a matter of dispute whether it's the same thing as logical possibility, the same thing as epistemic possibility, or its own type of possibility. Chalmers seems, in his argument, to be treating it kind of as its own type of thing, or as logical possibility. It's not really important what it definitively means for our purposes. What is important is that it's not the same thing as physical possibility, right? We're just going to assume for our purposes, to simplify things, that it basically means logical possibility. So we have this idea that if we can have a clear and distinct idea of something, then that thing is therefore logically possible. There are no things of which we have clear and distinct ideas which are at the same time logically impossible. Okay? So think to yourself, can you have a clear and distinct idea of what a round square is? I mean, don't just try and visualize it. You probably can't even do that. But, can you write a description of what it would be for something to both be a circle and a square at the same time? The idea is that you can't. Okay? So because you can't conceive of that, then it is therefore not possible for something to be round and square at the same time. Okay. If the zombie world is conceivable, then it is metaphysically possible. So what we're saying here is that there could be such a world, right? Not that our world is one, or that even our world could have been that world, but simply that such a world exists in logical space, as we say, right? If we were to give a map of all the things which are logically possible, there is a world right up here which is physically identical to ours, but there's no consciousness, right? So there could have been such a world. Now, here comes the big part. If a zombie world is metaphysically possible, then facts about consciousness are facts over and above physical facts. So the idea is that if a world which is physically identical to ours, but in which there is no consciousness, if that is logically possible, that means that consciousness facts are not automatically generated or do not logically attach to physical facts, right? So consciousness facts are in some way separate from physical facts. They are additional to them. You can't just read consciousness facts off of physical facts. Yeah, I've said the same thing a couple of ways. Hopefully you understand what that means. So if physical facts do not fix consciousness facts, if consciousness facts vary independently in some way of physical facts, then in a world in which there actually is consciousness, those facts are distinct from physical facts. And if consciousness facts are distinct from physical facts, right, well then physicalism is false. Because physicalism, at least one way to put physicalism, is the idea that there are only physical facts. But if Chalmers' zombie argument proves that there are facts other than physical facts, then physicalism is false because it says that there are not facts other than physical facts. So this is where Chalmers' zombie argument is supposed to land us. It's supposed to we don't have to do any sort of scientific investigation. We're just sitting here in our armchair, as it were, doing some thinking, and we're like, oh, well, the world contains more than just physical facts, because it's logically possible that there's a world like ours, physically speaking, in which the human beings that are there have no conscious experience. Because that's a logical possibility, the fact that we have conscious experience has to be explained in facts in terms other than physical terms. Okay? So that's what Chalmers' zombie argument is supposed to do. As a matter of fact, Chalmers, at least at one point in time, advocated for something that we might refer to as panpsychism. That is, this idea that consciousness is kind of this thing which is everywhere to some extent. It's too complicated to explain, but his explanation for why there is actually consciousness is a bit bizarre. But it's this idea that sort of consciousness is this, sometimes we talk about it as an emergent property. It's a non-physical property which sort of just kind of shows up. If you've ever read the Philip Pullman books, like The Golden Compass and all that, somewhere in there's an explanation of consciousness, which is kind of like this. There are these like consciousness particles that get attracted to creatures of sufficient sophistication, and that's kind of explains why some creatures can think and other ones can't, right? That's kind of the sort of thing that Chalmers eventually says, but we don't have to agree with anything like that to get the point across here. Chalmers is just saying that there has to be some non-physical explanation for consciousness, because you could replicate all the physical facts of our world and yet not also replicate the consciousness facts of our world. So, criticisms of this, these are like very technical criticisms of the argument, focus on the two crucial premises. So it being a conceivability argument, people attack it as a version of a conceivability argument. So these aren't particularly aimed at the content of the argument or the structure of the argument. Well, the first part is kind of aimed at the content. The idea is that zombies aren't actually conceivable. When you think that you are imagining a creature physically identical to you, but for whom there is kind of nothing going on inside, right? A physical creature that when its tongue is awash in coffee, will say things like, "Oh, this is hot. Oh, this is bitter," but won't actually taste bitterness or feel heat. When you think you're doing that, you're not actually conceiving that, right? So one of the primary people who argues something like this is Daniel Dennett. He says that it's much harder to conceive of something than people think. Conceiving of something is more than imagining it or envisioning it or writing down a sentence describing it. It's giving a complete and coherent account of what that thing would be like. And Dennett says that if you really tried to do that, if you really tried to give a full account of how zombies are behaviorally identical to you, physically identical to you, but yet do not have any conscious experience, you couldn't do it. So Chalmers is assuming that that we can have a clear and distinct idea of zombies, but he's just wrong. That's not possible. So that's one criticism of the zombie argument. The second is a more general and formal criticism. It's just saying that conceivability doesn't entail possibility, or at least not in the right way for Chalmers to get the conclusion that he wants. So the idea is mostly that there are certain kinds of necessity which exist, which are not perceptible from the armchair, or a priori, as is another piece of technical jargon in philosophy. So imagine somebody before the advent of chemistry. They have no idea what H2O is or what that means, or what like molecules and elements and atoms are. They don't know what that is. They still know what water is, and they can imagine. We can think of them imagining water as, I don't know. Let's be very sort of condescending here and say they're imagining it as, the blood of the ocean god or something like that. So it's not H2O, it's divine blood or something like that. We can sit here and we can tell that story. And we can ourselves think, well, I can imagine water being that way, or I can imagine myself believing water is that way. But the facts on the ground, which sort of are discovered by chemistry, show us that water is H2O, and they're the same thing. And so when they're not disputing that you can conceive of that, right? You can give this full account of it. But they're saying the fact that you can do that doesn't tell you anything about what water could or could not have been. There are some weird necessities which are post-logical. I mean, there's no way to explain this without getting into the technical vocabulary of sort of logic and philosophy of language, and I don't want to do that. But the idea is just that there are some necessities which we discover by doing actual observation and scientific work, which aren't discoverable by just sort of sitting there in your armchair and doing logical thinking. And so the kind of conceivability that's at issue here is sitting in your armchair and thinking conceivability. But that kind of work can't discover everything that is actually the way possibility and necessity are. So you can sit here and you can do that, but that doesn't force the world to be a particular way, right? That's about the best that I can explain it. And it's obviously not too important that you can hammer out the details yourself, because we're doing this at a pretty superficial level. The real point is that Chalmers is arguing that because you can think of something, that thing is possible. And because that thing is possible, it has a particular consequence for the way the world is best explained. Okay. So a slightly more accessible version of the point that Chalmers is making is what you're going to look at for your reading sequence this week. So you will be reading Thomas Nagel's very well-known article, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Great name. And so you're going to read that. And I've already told you that it's making a similar point to what Chalmers is making. But it doesn't need to go into this technical detail to do it. So hopefully it will be a bit more accessible, and it will give you the idea of why someone might object to physicalism. That is, object to the idea that everything that can be explained, everything that there is to know about the world can be described in this sort of third-person scientific-y way, right? Scientific-y, that's not a word. Scientific way. So that's chapter 85. That's what you'll be doing. Your active reading assignment group discussion, and individual summary on. So hopefully, despite this being somewhat technical and long, you got something out of both of the lecture recordings for this week.